So next case study, I'm going to share one of mine this time. And this was one of the cases, one of my favorite cases. It happened very early on in my functional medicine career, back in around 2008, 2009. And this was a lady named Maggie. And the story was an interesting one because at the time I had my personal mobile number on the website, and she phoned. I was nodding off to sleep at about 11:30 at night on a Saturday evening. And this phone call came through. I'd forgotten to switch the phone off. And she left a voicemail. And when I listened to the voicemail on the Sunday morning, it was a very frail lady leaving the voicemail. You could barely hear her. Very frail and sounded very scared, very anxious as well. And then she called again on the Sunday morning, and it's my policy not to answer the phone at the weekends. So on Monday morning, I got right back to her straight away, and we had a quick chat as to what was going on. And what had happened is she'd literally had some digestive symptoms since she was about 5 years old. And she'd been reading the website, and she had been interested in the idea that sometimes we can have chronic digestive infections for many, many years, and they can just sit there and cause minor to moderate symptoms on an ongoing basis. And she wondered whether that might have been the situation with her. But more pressing was the fact that she'd developed some pretty severe diarrhea recently, to the point where she was housebound now. What happened is, because of this ongoing sort of moderate digestive situation that she'd had for about 70 years, you know, she was in her mid-70s by the time she contacted us. She'd been to see the doctor, and they tested her positive for H. pylori. And, you know, the classical treatment for H. pylori is triple therapy. It's 2 antibiotics and 1 acid blocking medication, and you take them all at once. And that's designed to kill off the H. pylori, because they found that just using 1 antibiotic on its own doesn't work very well back in the 1990s. So she'd been on this triple therapy, and it hadn't really improved anything at all. Without any retesting, the doctor just gave another one. Take it again for another 7 days. So she took it again for another 7 days, and nothing really improved. So the doctor just said, take it again. Gave her another 7 days worth. And that's when the problem started. So as we know, when you take antibiotics, there's a threat or a risk that you can upset your microbiome. The friendly bacteria, the fungi, the digestive flora, if you like, that are so important to our health. And she'd taken these 3 courses of antibiotics, and by the end of the 3rd one, she developed this really nasty diarrhea situation where she'd be going to the loo many times a day, and she'd been now afraid to get out of the house for fear of literally being incontinent and not being able to control her bowels while she was out in public places. And so this was not a particularly good situation to be in. So I said, right, what I'd like to do is run a stool test. I want to see what's going on in there, because we can't be certain that H. pylori is the only problem. Now you've taken all of these antibiotics and, you know, you've kicked in with all of this diarrhea, because there's a risk of having other bacteria and problems developing, overgrowing, or even infections from taking all these antibiotics, like Clostridium difficile, for example, which causes diarrhea. And I wanted to rule all of that stuff out, because that would have been a slightly more difficult situation to deal with. So long story short, we got the stool test results through, and she still had the H. pylori. So there must have been an antibiotic resistant strain of H. pylori, probably to one of the antibiotics that she'd been given in the treatment. But because the doctor hadn't changed the treatment, knocking out H. pylori with that antibiotic combination was probably virtually impossible. So we got into a situation where not only did the initial treatment not work, but it caused other problems as well, which is relatively common. You know, it's not an everyday occurrence with our clients, but I'd say a couple of times a month, we come across people of that sort of nature, where the medical treatment that was initially given with good intention has actually caused more problems than it's resolved. So she also had, on this stool test result, a parasite called Blastocystis hominis, quite a common one. And she also had some yeast and fungal overgrowth in her digestive system as well. So what we did, basically changed the diet to very simple, gluten-free, dairy-free, processed food minimal diet. Just get the basics right, because nobody had ever given her any advice or coaching on diet, right? So we got that sorted. That already started to improve things for her. Then we ran a herbal protocol to knock out the H. pylori. Then we ran a herbal protocol to knock out the blastocystis hominis and the yeast and fungal overgrowth. And then we retested. In the retest, the H. pylori had gone, the yeast and fungal overgrowth had gone, but the blastocystis hominis was still there. However, the great news was, on a subjective or from a subjective perspective, all the symptoms had gone. Like all of them. The diarrhea had cleared up. The original symptoms that she'd had for 70 years were not there anymore. She felt brighter in herself, more energized. Her moods improved, and she could get out of the house and live a normal life again. All in the space of about 3 or 4 months, we were able to get those results. So it was a combination of dietary changes and antimicrobial activities within the program that worked. And so that was a much simpler program than the one that you administered with Carly. We didn't really need to do any additional testing with Maggie, but we somehow managed to clear up 70 years of symptoms and a few months of very nasty symptoms, all within the space of, 2 or 3 months, really. And so that was a really cool case study. Now, the blastocystis hominis still being there in the retest.
Yeah, that's what I was wondering about. How did she feel about still finding that, and how did you?
Yeah, well, it's interesting because, as you know, Jack, when we run stool tests, when we get the results back, we're looking for patterns and how those findings relate to how a person feels.
Yeah.
We're not suggesting that every single marker on that test is relevant to the symptoms. And this is a different way of thinking to the medical system. The medical system is very much, we find a pathogen, we treat it. So if that organism is there, if it's detected, we are going to assume that it's a huge problem, and we're going to knock it out with antibiotics or whatever treatments we use to knock it out with. We're saying some of these things that we find in the stool test are a little bit of a gray area. In some people, blastocystis hominis can cause major problems.
Yeah.
I had digestive problems because of blastocystis hominis. Once I cleared my H. pylori, I needed to then get rid of the blasto before I optimized my digestive function. So it was like a little bit of a stepping stone to my digestive wellness. Getting rid of H. pylori improved it massively, but there were still a few issues left. Then getting rid of blastocystis and the mold overgrowth, aspergillus, that I had, did the rest and got me completely out of the symptom profile. With Maggie, it didn't seem that the blasto was causing any problems.
Yep.
And so the research on blasto as a parasite suggests that certain strains are pathogenic to humans and certain ones aren't. And it may also be a relationship between the person's immune system and the organism. So not just the organism, but how is my immune system versus Maggie's immune system viewing that organism? Is it friend or foe? And so we're more of, when it comes to blasto and some of the other parasites in particular, we're not thinking all the time that is necessarily a disaster if somebody has that parasite. It may just be part of their flora. It may not need to be dealt with. And maybe it's more about how the rest of their body is operating, their immune system, etc., which determines whether that particular organism is causing a problem. So with her, it wasn't. Now, she wasn't bothered about still having the blasto there at all. She was only interested in being able to live a life again. Didn't matter. So she knew how to eat properly now. She felt great. There was no need to run any more programs and spend any more money on getting rid of the blasto. However, I've worked with other clients who were disappointed that they still had something showing up in their second stool test, even though they felt really good now. So, maybe I'll share one of those stories on a future edition. But one guy
you could end up kind of chasing something that it actually doesn't make you feel any better, and you create more challenges because you create more balances if you don't look at that sort of bigger picture, like you were saying.
So you feel stressed because there's still an organism showing up in your stool test that theoretically shouldn't be there. Even though your symptoms have gone and you feel great, the fact that organism's there still stresses you out. That in itself is enough to potentially create symptoms when the organism's just sitting there going, I'm just having a great time here. I'm not going to cause any trouble whatsoever. But our mindset the way we've been programmed by the medical system is that every germ is an enemy.
Mm-hmm.
The reality is some germs are definitely pathogens and enemies. There are many in the gray area, the gray zone, whereby they're only problematic in some people and under some or certain situations. And we're interested in figuring out what those relationships and those situations look like, rather than labeling things as definitely good and definitely bad. Furthermore, right, there are certain types of organism in the GI tract that are meant to be there. Lactobacillus, for example. If lactobacillus overgrows, it, in comparison to some of its neighbors, Bifidobacter and a whole bunch of the other ones, it can cause problems. So that's where a good bug becomes bad, potentially. But it doesn't mean it's inherently bad. It just means that something's changed in the person's body to lead it into a scenario where it is deemed to be bad, where it's causing problems. So it's all about looking at the patterns and always tying in the objective info from the tests with how the person feels.